Okay, let's begin. Thanks everybody for joining the latest webinar from Verifi entitled CE3.0. Are you ready? Focusing on compelling evidence 3.0 and order insight. Today's presentation is presented by Lisa Poulter-Tennant and Jeff Sawicki. If you have any questions about today's content, please add them to the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. We will be hosting a live Q&A session after the presentation. And you can also download the slides from today's presentation and the supporting Order Insight FAQ from the top right-hand side of your screen. Over to you, Lisa.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here with us today. I'm Lisa Poulter-Tennant, and I lead the Global Client Relations team at Verifi. I've been a member of Team Verifi for 8+ years and in payments for more than 25 in a variety of roles focused on helping merchants optimize dispute management. I'm joined today by an expert in dispute mitigation, Jeff Sawicki. Jeff, will you introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Lisa. Great to be with you again on a webinar. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Jeff Sawicki, one of the founding employees of Verifi, approaching 17 years experience here, and prior to that was at Cardinal Commerce, also a Visa company. So I'm just north of 20 years of payment experience, and really excited about disputes and fraud mitigation and the topics we're going to be covering here today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. There has been a ton of buzz surrounding Compelling Evidence 3.0 since Visa first announced the rule change, and Jeff and I will be using our time together today to ensure that you're fully equipped and ready to take advantage of all the benefits that CE 3.0 has to offer. We're going to start with an overview of Compelling Evidence 3.0, the rule change specifically, and how it will enable you to shift liability back to the issuer on eligible Visa 10.4 disputes. Jeff will walk you through systematic 10.4 dispute deflection through Order Insight, and will equip you with best practices to achieve optimal deflection rates at launch and beyond. Let's start with a quick reflection on how we arrived here. Merchants have been challenged with first-party misuse, also known as friendly fraud, for longer than most of us here have been in payments. The volume of these disputes really spiked during COVID, specifically for card-not-present merchants, as consumers shifted their primary spending to online channels. Fortunately for merchants, increased card-not-present sales have sustained post-pandemic. However, so have elevated dispute volumes. I know everyone here knows disputes are costly. In addition to lost revenue, they're costing you precious time and resources to manage. There are also increased processor fees and the risk for exceeding dispute monitoring thresholds, which carry the risk for fines, and if they're left unchecked, will put your ability to accept payments at risk. Visa recognized first-party misuse as an industry issue, and Compelling Evidence 3.0 was designed to address that. Jeff is going to walk you through specifically how Compelling Evidence 3.0 will equip you to effectively deflect first-party misuse disputes.
Thanks, Lisa, for that backdrop of the problem. So given the rise of first-party misuse, the Visa rule team made a significant announcement in June of 2022. With that, they introduced a new dispute remedy for merchants to combat first-party misuse, and that's what we're referring here as Compelling Evidence 3.0. What's also significant about this rule change is that it introduces a new alternative approach for merchants to combat these 10.4 fraud disputes, and that's the pre-dispute flow, which we're gonna speak to. Up to this point, merchants have had access to what we call the post-dispute flow, or through the acquirer's pre-arbitration responses. And that's been the way that merchants have handled disputes in the past. And this rule still applies there as well. And so merchants, through their acquirer, will be able to leverage this new compelling evidence rule to share additional information about historical transactions to achieve that data sharing and allow the compelling evidence rule to be applied for the objective of showing that those are invalid disputes and obtaining that liability should benefit. But going back to pre-dispute, that's what's really significant and unique here. And that's where Verifi's Order Insight service comes into play. So we've been working for the last several months, quarters, to enhance our platform and our Order Insight APIs and capabilities to allow merchants to share data that allows us to apply these compelling evidence rules to achieve this objective through this pre-dispute flow. The benefits, which we're going to spend some time to go into more depth as well, but at a high level, both for the pre-dispute and post-dispute flow, merchants leveraging this rule can obtain a liability shift and block that 10.4 dispute from occurring. There is some differences between the pre-dispute and the post-dispute. The significant one being in pre-dispute, we're sharing information and applying this rule before the dispute is actually completely submitted and processed by Visa. And so for that, we're able to prevent that dispute from counting towards the merchant's dispute ratios. And also, because we're focused here on 10.4 fraud, when it's blocked using the compelling evidence rules, the fraud ratio is also adjusted so that these disputes don't count towards your fraud ratio. That's really significant. That benefit also applies to post-dispute, where the fraud ratio is reversed out. If the merchant shares information through the pre-arbitration process, the dispute is overturned, it's cited in favor of the merchant, the fraud ratio is reduced, but because that dispute has been raised and merchants have used that post-dispute flow, the dispute itself still counts towards the ratios. So that's a key differentiator between the pre and post-dispute flows. So now let's step into more specifics about the compelling evidence rule and what the data requirements are. All right, so when we look at the requirements for the compelling evidence 3.0 rule and what goes into determining if the rule conditions are met, there's key aspects of this. And so essentially the rule is focused on the transaction that's being disputed, looking at data that's collected and provided by the merchant for that particular transaction, and comparing those data attributes to historical prior transactions that have taken place between that cardholder identified by the PAN and the merchant. So when we talk about the compelling evidence rule, we're looking at historical transactions. That's the left side here. That's the key. We need to have at least 2 prior transactions than the one that's being disputed between the cardholder and the merchant. And again, we're focused here on card not present 10.4 disputes. So we need prior card not present transactions to create this historical link between the cardholder and this transaction set and the transaction that's ultimately being disputed that we're trying to overturn. So when we say historical, we're looking for transactions that have taken place between 120 and 365 days prior to the current date. And so that's that historical window where we're looking for those prior transactions. So what's significant here is this applies for recurring business models, right? The subscription economy, a lot of capabilities are out there to defend and mitigate fraud on the first occurrence of the transaction. Here with this program, it allows us to offer this, and merchants who use that recurring or subscription billing model can take advantage of this rule and the information they're able to collect from those prior transactions. There is an asterisk here. This has to do with, there's some exceptions around Visa Direct account funding transactions and original credit transactions related to some wallets. And so there is some other nuance there that we can walk you through. But the primary use case and what we want to focus on today are those card not present transactions. What's also important about these historical transactions is that there cannot be any fraud activity on those historical transactions. We're very specifically not saying not any disputes, because it could have been that there was a shipment of a product and it was damaged and the cardholder filed a non-fraud dispute against that transaction. That would allow that transaction to qualify. We're really just focused on historical transactions without any fraud activity. So now, looking at the right side of the screen here, we're focused specifically on certain data attributes that the merchant must collect and share about the transaction that's being disputed, as well as the historical transactions. And this is where we're going to spend more time today diving into these details. But essentially, we're looking at certain attributes to do the comparison, and in the event that those attributes are the same across between the transaction that's being disputed and the historical transactions, at least two, then that's what allows the rule, the compelling evidence 3.0 rule, and this remedy to be identified and validated to show that this data is consistent. Therefore, the transaction that's being raised as the 10.4 dispute is invalid, and it's going to be blocked by this rule change. Last point here to call out is when the data elements and what's listed, we're specifically focusing on the IP address or the device ID or the device fingerprint. One of those must match between the transaction that's being disputed and those historical transactions. So that hopefully gives everyone a better foundation and understanding. We're going to spend some time looking through some flows and getting into more specifics around this as well.
Let's touch on the history and the future of Order Insight. The idea for Order Insight originated while the Verifi team was observing issuer call center agents handle dispute inquiry calls with their cardholders. Our team realized if transaction details could be made available to issuers and cardholders at that point of inquiry, it would equip them with insight early on and would support dispute deflection in that pre-dispute phase. Order Insight was initially launched through the issuer call center experience, equipping issuers to access detailed purchase information in real time, supporting cardholder recognition and preventing the need for a dispute. Our issuer partners quickly realized the value of providing their cardholders with transaction details, and Order Insight was enhanced to support those issuers in making purchase details available in a self-serve capacity via their online and mobile banking applications. That's reflected here as the digital experience. With Visa's compelling evidence rule change effective April of 2023, Order Insight will be the mechanism for systematic dispute deflection for eligible Visa 10.4 disputes. When a merchant responds with qualified transaction data, Visa will shift dispute liability automatically back to the issuer. Systematic dispute deflection of qualified transactions through Order Insight will deliver significant value, starting with revenue retention. Once the compelling evidence 3.0 rule change is effective, qualified 10.4 disputes can be systematically deflected through Order Insight in the pre-dispute phase, and you will retain revenue that would have been previously lost to dispute. With dispute deflection through Order Insight, eligible qualified 10.4 fraud disputes are prevented and not counted against your fraud or dispute ratios. This will also assist you in staying below Visa's fraud monitoring and dispute monitoring program thresholds. Systematic dispute deflection takes place in the pre-dispute phase. You'll hear that from me repeatedly. This means it never reaches your processor, and therefore you avoid dispute and representment fees and also fines associated with Visa's fraud and dispute monitoring programs, reducing your dispute-related costs. And last but not least, pre-dispute deflection also translates to lower operational costs for you as a merchant. Less time spent handling customer inquiries, less time spent handling disputes and representments, saving you money and allowing you to focus valuable operational resources on growing your business.
Great. Thanks, Lisa, for going over the benefits. Now let's get into more specifics on how it works. How is this going to work for Order Insight and the systematic dispute deflection? So if you're someone that likes details, you're going to like the next few minutes. We're going to go through step by step the flow from the issuer to Visa to Verifi to the merchant and back, and hopefully paint a very clear picture for how this is going to operate. So when we're talking about 10.4 and disputes in general, they all start from the cardholder and the issuer. So point number one here on the left side, we have the cardholder reporting fraud on the purchase. This could be the issuer tagged the transaction, did some outreach with the cardholder, they confirmed that that transaction was fraud. Various means for this to get started. But here the issuer in step two is raising this 10.4 dispute with Visa. And this is where the pre-dispute flow triggers, and we start to see the integration of Order Insight and merchants for the compelling evidence program. We start with bullet number 3. The first thing is checking to see, is this merchant participating in Order Insight? The way that we do that is through something that's referred to as the acquirer BIN and CADE, or the card acceptor ID. These are the attributes that uniquely identify your merchant account to Visa. And every transaction has these attributes on them, and it's what we use to identify if this transaction and this merchant is participating in the Order Insight program. So assuming that yes, this merchant's participating, the first thing we do is we request information at step 4 for the disputed purchase. So our merchants who are currently live on Order Insight today, this is the behavior and the activity that you see occurring now. And so the request will send transaction data elements, allow you at step 5 to then query your system for those purchase details. And then at step 6, you're returning that response back to Verifi and giving and providing information about that order. What's really important here as we're looking forward and supporting this compelling evidence 3.0 rule is that those data attributes that we spoke of earlier need to be added to that merchant response. So the account ID, the IP address, the device ID, delivery, it's critical that merchants return that information at step 6 because that's what is going to be evaluated to see if this dispute that's being raised is going to be eligible for the compelling evidence rules. So at step 7, assuming that that information is returned from the merchant, Visa will then do that evaluation on that merchant response and see that, yes, this information is returned from the merchant, and therefore Visa can search their repository for information and identify 2 to 5 historical transactions that took place between the cardholder based on the PAN and the merchant to request additional information, those historical transactions, so that the data comparison can take place. So what we have represented here at steps 7, 8, and 9 This is the iterative calls, so 2 to 5 calls will be made through this process to retrieve the information for these historical transactions from the merchant and allow Visa then at step 10 to compare the data returned from the disputed transaction at step 6 to these historical transactions returned at step 9 to then evaluate the rule and apply that rule in the pre-dispute phase of the life cycle. Once that determination is made, then we know if, based on the rule and the conditions of the rule being met, if that 10.4 dispute is being blocked or if it will continue down the standard dispute flow. And that's what's represented here at step 11, where Visa will return that response back to the issuer to indicate in real time if that dispute has been blocked or if it's been received and will be processed. And then the issuer can handle that operationally on their side at step 12, how they want to process and coordinate that. So what's really interesting or important to call out here is this is all happening pre-dispute in real time. So when we get into our APIs and response time SLAs and things of that nature, it's really important that merchants understand that we are doing this in this transaction flow, in the pre-dispute flow, to drive as much value to the merchant as we can and as much benefit. And because of that, that's why we have some pretty tight and short-term or low 2-second SLA response times, is because it's imperative that we get this information from your system quickly so that we can apply these rules and drive these deflections. So now we're going to transition over and actually look at an example. All right, so here we have an example. We just stepped through the flow. Now let's look at what that flow would support as we do the data comparisons, retrieve that information from the merchant, and determine the outcome. So on the left side of the screen here, we're focused on a cardholder-initiated fraud dispute on November 15th. So this is the disputed transaction. So in this case, the merchant's participating in Order Insight, so we can leverage this pre-dispute capability, and we've made the request of the merchant, and the merchant's returned information about that transaction. So they've provided the account ID, the IP address, the delivery address, the device ID, and the device fingerprint. And you'll note, like the account ID, I did mention this before, but I want to make sure to call it out. This is something that should be cardholder recognizable, cardholder facing. So the intent here is when the cardholder establishes a relationship with your business, when they set up their accounts, or maybe it's a travel rewards number or something that they would identify, that's what's intended to be shared here, and something that would help the cardholder recognize the transaction and allow them to recall it and understand that this is not really fraud. And then we have delivery address. I want to also call out this point. It's not just the address, city, state, zip. It's also country. So the specifications you'll see are very specific. We need all of those attributes. And so there could be instances where maybe a merchant today is not collecting an address because you're a digital goods merchant and you don't need it. Maybe you're just collecting the zip code for AVS checks. And so that's something, as you're evaluating this program and your potential to support and leverage the rule, it's important to consider all the data attributes and what you're collecting. So for this disputed transaction, because we've got this data returned, we now know that Visa can search and identify prior historical transactions to do this data comparison and identify if this disputed transaction can be blocked using the compelling evidence 3.0 rule. So in this case, in the center, we have a dispute date or the historical transaction dispute date minus 156 days. And then the transaction on the right minus 266 days. So this is between that 120 to 365 day window. So that's what makes these transactions eligible to review the information and determine if we have a match. You can see in the historical transaction in the middle, we have all the information except the device fingerprint returned. And then for the historical transaction on the right, we have all the same data attributes returned here. So there's some check boxes and some X's where those data elements are the same and consistent. And so you can see in the lower left, we have a match across the disputed transaction, the historical transaction 1, historical transaction 2, the account ID in all 3 transactions matches. So that's great. We have the same match on the delivery address, disputed transaction, historical transaction 1, historical transaction 2, all the same address. That's what allows that to match and qualify. And then device ID. So device ID or IP address or device fingerprint. So because we have that device ID and it's the same value across the disputed transaction, historical transaction 1, historical transaction 2, that's what allows this rule and this remedy to be applicable. And the outcome here is this disputed transaction would be blocked for this 10.4 dispute based on this compelling evidence 3.0 rule enabled through Order Insight through our systematic dispute deflection.
From Order Insight's inception, we've guided merchants to respond to Order Insight inquiries with the same compelling evidence data they provide when representing a dispute. I cannot emphasize this point enough. Your deflection rate is a direct reflection of the quality of the data you respond with. Jeff shared required data elements introduced with Compelling Evidence 3.0, and I'd like to walk through a few scenarios sharing how early adopters will be applying their data. For the purpose of these examples, we're focusing in on the data elements that qualify you for liability shift on 10.4 eligible disputes. As a reminder, to qualify for CE 3.0 eligibility, in addition to minimum required fields for matching, merchants must also respond to OI inquiries with a minimum of 2 of the following items: account ID, delivery address, IP address, device ID, or device fingerprint. And one of the 2 must be either IP address, device ID, or device fingerprint. Our first example is a monthly subscription billing merchant. They capture consumer IP address at the point of sale, and they retain that detail in their customer account records. To ensure qualification for Compelling Evidence 3.0 deflection eligibility, the merchant is responding with the minimum required fields, including IP address. To achieve the 2 minimum required, they will also respond with at least 1 or more of the following: account ID, delivery address, device ID, or device fingerprint. Now you'll notice the recurring bill merchant is providing IP address in this example within their Order Insight response. For those of you who are recurring billers, you're likely wondering, we only capture that data at the point of sale, not on subsequent billings which are initiated by us, not by the cardholder. So how can we respond with IP address on subsequent transactions? Visa's CE 3.0 rule allows recurring merchants to respond to inquiries on subsequent related billings with the IP address that was captured at the point of sale. So this is your call to action to make sure you capture and store IP address on initial transactions and include that data in your response to all related Order Insight inquiries. Our next example reflects an online retailer, and the majority of their transactions take place via their mobile app. The merchant captures and retains both device ID and device fingerprint. As Jeff shared, merchants can respond with device ID or device fingerprint, and as you can see here, the merchant is responding with device ID. For clarity, merchants can respond with both device ID and fingerprint. However, to qualify for CE3.0 deflection, in a scenario like this, the merchant must also provide at least one or more of the following: account ID, delivery address, or IP address. Our third example reflects a merchant responding with device fingerprint. Similar to the last scenario, the merchant should respond with at least one or more of the following: account ID, delivery address, or IP address to ensure they've delivered a qualified, compelling evidence 3.0 response. In addition to these fields that we've highlighted today, Order Insight supports more than 100 other data elements. So to ensure that you drive the best deflection rate, whether it's through the issuer call center experience, the digital experience, or through systematic dispute deflection, it's critical that you provide the best, most complete, compelling evidence available. Verifi will work closely with you through the integration and onboarding process to ensure that you're sending all eligible information and we're equipping you to be as successful as possible. We also provide additional guidance in the Verifi API to help guide you as you prepare for integration.
Thanks, Lisa. So transitioning now to merchant dispute deflection best practices. So what can merchants do now? You've learned about the compelling evidence rule. Hopefully you're very interested in adopting and using either the pre-dispute services or leveraging this through your acquire and the post-dispute capabilities. Now let's talk about what can you do today ahead of April 2023 when this rule goes into effect. And we've got a few points to cover here. So the first one is evaluate your descriptors. This applies in both the pre and dispute and post-dispute flows. Essentially, you need to ensure that Visa can properly match transactions from your business to the cardholder and maintain that historical connection. And so what we see is as merchants use multiple acquirers, maybe there's some subtle format differences or some uniqueness in how those descriptors are presented and displayed and represented on those transactions. So the more consistent you can make your descriptors, then the better and more success Visa will have at linking those transactions together and allow you to leverage the compelling evidence rules. Also, on the data that you capture and store. So we've reviewed today the data attributes that are needed for the compelling evidence rules. Ensure that you're capturing that information, you have that data readily available for servicing, whether it's through the Order Insight capabilities or through your post-dispute operational flows. Ensure that you have access to that data, you can search it, you can link it, and you can return that data. And then the last two are specific to the pre-dispute flows where I mentioned this earlier. Because pre-dispute is all real time, we do have a 2-second response time SLA to the request we make of your system to retrieve data about those orders. So ensuring that not only do you have the data, but then you've got the proper optimized API to promptly, quickly return that information when we're making those calls to your system. And then the final point, just ensuring that Verifi and through our relationship working together, you're sharing and enrolling all of the accounts that you want to have enrolled in the program so that we can maximize the coverage and maximize those benefits for you.
This slide should look familiar, and we brought it back around to reinforce the expanded value of Order Insight. With Visa's Compelling Evidence 3.0 rule change in April, Order Insight will support 3 methods for deflecting disputes. The first 2 are already in place. Cardholders' ability to access transaction details in a self-serve capacity via their issuer's online and mobile banking tools, the cardholder digital experience. Also, issuers utilizing order detail to help cardholders recognize transactions, preventing disputes at inquiry or intake through the call center experience. And of course, systematic dispute deflection, available following the rule change in April. These 3 combined are a powerful combination, enabling you to deflect disputes, retain revenue, and reduce operational expense. Thank you so much for joining us today. Jeff and I really appreciate the opportunity to share information on Visa's Compelling Evidence 3.0 rule change, key details to achieving Visa's 10.4 dispute deflection through Order Insight, and best practices to ensure optimal dispute deflections at launch.